Hello. The sanctions pressure on the Russian Federation continues to increase across the entire oil and gas agenda. Our conversation today is with Igor Yushkov, a leading analyst at the National Energy Security Fund, about the latest EU decisions in the gas sector and their consequences for the Russian Federation and the European Union itself. Hello, Igor Valeryevich. We're glad to see you in our studio again. I'd like to start with this point. As is known, the European Union has approved a plan to completely abandon Russian gas by the 1st of January 2028, taking into account the gradual termination of short-term and long-term contracts. In this regard, what volumes of gas will the Russian Federation need to redirect to other markets? And how sensitive will this be financially? Well, on one hand, not much seems to be left now, in 2025, of our supplies, but on the other hand, they want to completely sever relations in any energy resources. The next step is that in the 19th package they managed to push through the rejection of Russian LNG, also in stages. From April 2026, it will be prohibited to import Russian LNG under short-term contracts, and from 2027 under long-term contracts. There was also an intermediate stage, a ban on transshipment in European ports, and further, essentially, the re-export of Russian LNG. And sir, Russian LNG will gradually leave the European market, although this is also a major threat. We are the second largest supplier after the United States of LNG to the European market. Naturally, even if new projects are launched in the United States, as the European Commission says, new plants will come, Russian LNG will replace these needs, and Qatar also seems to be launching new plants. We really see this. Although it's not certain they will come to the European market, there must be certain conditions, but they will replace it. Well, of course, they will come, yes, these plants will be launched, but if Russian LNG were also present, there would be even tougher competition, prices would be lower. It turns out that in our current presence, we have LNG consumed by a number of countries: Belgium, France, Spain, partially Germany through Spanish supply. This is approximately, in different units, somewhere around 22 to 24 billion. I might be wrong in the figures, but I saw such a moment. And there is gas that comes to the EU via the Turkish stream, through one line. As far as I understand, how much? Approximately 15 to 16? So more. Yes, if we take the figures, there is one gas pipeline left, the Turkish stream. One of the lines seems to be working for the European market, although, apparently, from the second line, a certain transition further goes to the European market, through Turkish traders, Greek traders, but somewhere around 16 to 16.5 billion cubic meters will be by the end of 2025. LNG, there is a slightly dynamic system, probably a little less than 20 billion cubic meters. In 2024, there was a little more LNG because, firstly, there was no maintenance at Yamal LNG, and secondly, there were also supplies from medium-tonnage LNG plants. This is Krivogaz, Vyzisk, Novatek and Port LNG Gazprom. In the Leningrad region, two plants, in total, produced approximately about 1.2 to 1.5 million tons per year, and all were also supplied to the European market. So the scale is not the same as the first refusal, much less. Yes, but in 1925, they practically did not work for Europe anymore, and almost completely stopped there for the domestic market, for more remote areas. Now the markets have gone for supplies from these two medium-tonnage ones, because they fell under the sanctions introduced by Biden. He added them to the SDN list, meaning all contacts are prohibited, and so they have been transforming throughout the year 2025. We'll see what happens next, but nevertheless, they no longer operated in the European market, meaning over 1 million tons of our LNG have already left, and now, in fact, everything that goes from Russia to Europe in the form of LNG is only Yamal LNG. It also ships some of its gas to Asia, but the majority, indeed the overwhelming part, is for the European market. It's convenient for everyone, a short transport distance. Transshipment usually took place in the Murmansk region, ship to ship, generally, and then non-ice class tankers were sent to the European market, or they were delivered to Northern Europe. I see. As is known, the LNG market is global, and demand is growing just like supply, perhaps at a slightly slower pace. It is known that the Asian region is beginning to progress sharply in terms of liquefied gas consumption. India is planning, as is known, to introduce 6 new terminals by the year 30 and become a major consumer. In this regard, here's a question, Igor Valerievich. How likely is it that the Russian Federation will be able to shift its volumes, find a niche in the Asian market without significant delays due to the situation arising with the European Union?
Here,
the big question is what we expected, what export volumes we will receive. If we talk about the energy strategy, which was relatively recently approved in Russia, the figures stated for LNG production are already unachievable. We won't increase volumes in these timeframes because then it was necessary to build serially, like Novatek, for example, planned to build in Belokamenka such a factory of factories, where new gas liquefaction lines would be built one after another in 2 slots. Arctic LNG 2 would be completed by the 3rd phase, immediately followed by either Murmansk LNG or Arctic 1, 3, and so on, and so on. Factories would simply be built serially, and volumes were laid down for this in the energy strategy. Plus, Gazprom's LNG plant in Ust-Luga and other projects. So far, we don't see such a pace. We are now adapting to new realities, both sanctions and market ones. In any case, we will be moving towards Asia. The Europeans have banned our LNG. These volumes, I think, will relatively calmly transition to Asian markets. India was mentioned as a kind of new locomotive of growth. So far, at least, we haven't seen such rates. Maybe it's just a delayed effect. In recent years, they have mainly developed coal generation. It's cheaper, more accessible for a low market where, frankly speaking, the consumer is quite poor. Therefore, such a leap in gas hasn't happened yet. China is still making this leap, but India could indeed become a kind of local growth driver. We now see a separate case with the German company CFE, which was formerly Gazprom Trading Singapore, which has a contract to purchase LNG from Yamal and resell almost the same volume contract with an Indian state company. And, accordingly, now Germany seems to want to say under the noise of the 19th package that this is not just a ban on imports into the European Union, but also a ban on European Union companies purchasing Russian LNG.
Не просто импорта в Евросоюз, а это еще и запрет на компании Евросоюза закупать российские СПГ. Поэтому посмотрим.
So we'll see if they can formalize all this, but nevertheless, we will be able to supply LNG directly to India from Yamal, and here the sales market will not change. In general, with the change of route, our logistics costs will probably increase. The transport distance is greater. Do you think this could affect the investment attractiveness of the projects themselves due to such a change?
I
think the attractiveness remains regardless. The issue with foreigners, but again, Western companies are not coming anyway. In fact, all our new LNG projects are under sanctions. Biden, in particular, had these farewell packages. They were aimed, among other things, at clearing the market for American projects, for American LNG. Therefore, almost all Russian LNG projects fell under sanctions, except for Yamal LNG in Sakhalin, apart from the 2 large-scale operating plants. Arctic 2, 1, 3, Murmansk LNG, which were only announced within the framework of Vostok Oil, in the Far East, in services, and it is clear that Western companies will not pass here. Therefore, for us, of course, this is a huge challenge. We are building our own large-scale LNG plants, medium-scale LNG plants. Our task is to master all the equipment, produce it ourselves, or negotiate, including cooperation with other Asian countries, with China. We see that they also have certain progress. After all, shipments, for example, from the same Arctic LNG 2 began in 1924. Ship 2 tankers, they went, including to Asia, stood off the coasts, in the Indian Ocean, and to China as well. And they did not accept them. And only in 1925, when the 2nd phase was launched, and to demonstrate its operability, shipments were also made. Only after this, and including high-level negotiations, did China start accepting it. So here the ice has also shifted, you could say. Yesterday, so to speak, they did not supply us with this equipment for the construction of new LNG plants. Tomorrow, maybe they will start doing it. Therefore, of course, the task is to maximize import substitution, and we see that there are also shifts in this direction in Russia. Yes, and they made an LNG stand. Here are a number of others, but fundamentally, firstly, we need to learn to build large-scale gas liquefaction plants ourselves. You see, the technologies are registered, and Novatek has them, and the Arctic Mix, and others, and Gazprom registered with you. But now we need to learn to build the equipment, everything needed to create these plants using these technologies. And the second problem is, of course, gas carriers. We see that there are difficulties with this too. At Zvezda, not a single one has been commissioned yet. Yes, there are at least 2 vessels of high readiness, but they were also built at one time in cooperation with South Korean shipbuilders, especially of high ice class. They are needed, Arctic 7. There are no such gas carriers in the world, except for the 15 that were built for Yamal LNG. Therefore, we cannot solve this as we solved the issue with the shadow fleet in oil. If we could just buy existing ships from the market, please, this could all be done quickly. Here the problems are greater because they simply do not exist. They need to be created somewhere. Therefore, we need to solve the problem with the construction of LNG plants, with the construction of gas carriers. We see that the problem with the sales market is gradually being resolved, at least in China. Here too is a big question, how much it can take, but we see that time, you could say, the country of China, it has also started accepting Russian sanctioned LNG not out of a good life. We see that the Americans are also actively pressing on it, and it perfectly understands that the more it develops, the more it makes the USA think. I would like to talk about the consequences of this decision for the EU itself. By refusing Russian gas, the European Union is betting on new LNG production capacities in Qatar and the United States, aiming for a market surplus from 1927 to 1928. And hoping that this surplus will allow it to switch to a different gas balance without significant price losses, without serious losses specifically from price increases. How justified are these EU expectations that the price situation will not change for them with the switch to LNG?
Оправданы вот эти вот ожидания Евросоюза, что ценовая конъюнктура для него в связи с переходом на СПГ не изменится?
Well, on one hand, you could say that they are putting themselves in a position where, a priori, the gas will be more expensive than it could have been, because they are refusing one of the largest suppliers. And plus, there might be an unpleasant surprise for them. The previous climate regulations they created are now starting to cause them difficulties. We see that literally at the same time, the energy ministers of the US and Qatar are creating a joint letter stating that the regulations Europe adopted require a certain package of documents, their climatic and others, not only from LNG supply companies on European markets but even from their contractors. So, it is a completely uncontrollable system. There will be some contractor who did something wrong, did not compile the correct report from the EU's point of view, and then you will be fined 5% of global turnover. And all this will start to take effect from 1927, from the moment you ban Russian LNG. I think that, of course, the pressure, primarily from the Americans, will lead to the Europeans changing this regulation. But at the moment, it shows a certain short-sightedness. The European Commission, and will the market itself transition after the EU refuses Russian gas? Will it remain in a surplus state due to supplies from the United States, or will we see a deficit market in the EU? Well, that's indeed a very good question. I think few have an exact answer to it, because, on one hand, large capacities are being introduced, on the other hand, consumption is growing. That is, China is increasing imports annually by 25 to 27 billion cubic meters. Several LNG plants, or a large gas pipeline, every year it imports more. Again, India is growing, all of Southeast Asia. We see that even in the United States itself, consumption is also increasing. And also an interesting point that Europeans do not discuss at all. Will the United States always be focused on export? Because now they have so many plants announced for commissioning and construction, as much as they are not increasing production volume. And it turns out that the very volumes they have now will face a choice. Either we supply the domestic market or for export. That is, they will gradually reach a state where the domestic market price will be determined by the export netback. And this clearly scares the Americans when they look at this detail, and even Biden, at the end of his term, introduced restrictions on issuing permits for the construction of new LNG plants. I think with roughly the same calculation, what if we have the same price as in Europe, minus the cost of delivery, liquefaction, and so on? There is one thing, that Trump will come to this as well. For him, on the contrary, it logically fits into his program, there, Make America Great Again. How will you make it great? Through cheap energy. They themselves talked about it. His whole story with drill, it concerns not only oil but also gas. And he was counting on enterprises from Europe, among others, moving to the USA because of the cheap energy here, certain incentives they offered, luring them in, but primarily cheap electricity, cheap gas, cheap fertilizer from this gas. And if this doesn't happen, if there is at least a risk of losing these competitive advantages, I think they can snap their fingers and say, right, we're slowing down, let's start issuing licenses. How much will we now export to maintain this tight situation in the domestic market, and an excess of low prices? And the Europeans do not take into account that, after all, America comes first there. But at the same time, they simply ban Russian LNG for political reasons. Moreover, representatives of the European Commission say that even if the Ukrainian conflict ends, we will not return to purchasing Russian energy resources. This is also, by the way, a big question. On what grounds do you intend not to return? Well, maybe, never say never, but nevertheless, at the moment it is there, it is present in the market. And they threaten both this and that with their regulation, which is completely inadequate in terms of their capabilities. Where will you get the gas from? Moreover, you yourself decided not to abandon it for now. In 2021, the European Commission recognized gas and nuclear as energy sources that contribute to the energy transition. And in this regard, it would be fine if you were actively developing green energy capacities, but we see that in green energy, on the contrary, there is a kind of sobering up happening in the European Union. They are increasingly investing in storage systems, in these accumulators, because they see that this is a vulnerable point in green energy. Therefore, it is not the right time to abandon gas completely. Therefore, it seems to me that something will change in the position of the European Union itself. After all, some rational grain must reach them. As is known, recently Germany, at the level of government decisions, reduced the requirements for forming reserves in underground gas storage due to the fact that the market is surplus, that the need can always be compensated by purchasing LNG, and in general, long-term gas storage is becoming economically unattractive due to this new price situation of two peaks in summer and winter, which crosses out the previous. Business model: we buy in summer, sell in winter, and have a certain margin. In this regard, does the European Union not have certain risks associated with high gas consumption during peak periods due to severe frosts and long cold spells, which, in principle, can shake their entire Well, in many ways, indeed. On the one hand, they seem to have calmed down in recent years because there were mild winters, and this brings some change in position. On the other hand, they are starting to discuss whether the requirements that existed were too high. In 1922, yes, they will indeed say that by the beginning of the heating season, it is necessary to have 90% fullness of underground storage. But since then, in general, consumption has fallen sharply. That is, they have reduced gas consumption by almost 100 billion cubic meters due to excessively high prices. Moreover, by the way, they don't like to talk about excessively high prices now. They started in 1921. Since then, this expensive gas, expensive energy, has led to some deindustrialization. And only now, in 1925, they have started to retreat a little and approximately 13 billion cubic meters. They are currently increasing consumption compared to 2024. So let's see what happens next, recovery or no recovery. But many say, why 90% accumulation? This was relevant with the previous level of consumption, but not now. And in 2025, by the way, they still did not meet the overall European standard. And in Germany, I think, one of the underground storage facilities was even closed. And the regulators, I think, even made a decision to reduce the main storage too. 45%. So yes, they did not achieve it, but I don't think this will create more problems compared to if they had reached 90%. But here the question is about the weather. Will the same thing happen as in the last few years? There were years when in Germany the temperature didn't drop below zero at all. It was something like 15 degrees on New Year's Day. So, of course, much depends on this, but on the contrary, it turns out that if we do see a frosty winter, usually a frosty winter occurs throughout the northern hemisphere, and then they will run into the same problems again. This is a new feature of the market, that they are always forced to compete between the European and Asian markets. If it's cold there, they will also consume a lot, pay more, and you will have to pay even more to get the gas to you. So this system of some kind of price arbitration is a new reality. For Europe, if we really follow the rhetoric of the European Union, the break in gas relations with the Russian Federation is final and irreversible. But the question arises, will these be the priorities in the post-liberal era? After all, the relationship can really change radically. As you said, never. Say never. Here we really can't say that we've definitely gone somewhere. It's the end of history. Even the capacities, again, for gas pumping, they remain. It's not for nothing that we were each other's main trading partners in energy. It wasn't some kind of political choice. It was precisely an economic choice. This is the most efficient for us in terms of oil supplies. Rotterdam was unloaded, returned back to southern Europe, also passing through Novorossiysk. There is coal, again, the same, gas. It was all there. Moreover, if we remember history, after the First World War we began to actively trade with those we fought against, with Germany. And after the Second World War, this also happened. Again, economic logic prevailed. Maybe it will return now and happen again. We'll see. Now, of course, the politicization of all economic issues in energy is off the scale. And it doesn't even allow the same European, German industrialists, who used to largely shape relations with Russia, to open their mouths. Because now the politicians who are in power, they not only have political questions in their heads, they even put political interests not of their own country at the forefront. They say, we will buy American LNG. They promise the USA to purchase $750 billion worth of energy resources over the next 3 years, although now they buy 60 to 70 a year. This is already an unrealistic figure. They travel, even people whom we call more or less independent in Europe, like Orban, go to the United States to ask for permission to buy Russian hydrocarbons. But of course, it's difficult to talk about sovereignty here, so, well, at the very least, the situation should also improve for the Europeans themselves, so that, in general, their economy also feels better. Oh yes, indeed, never say never. Thank you very much for the conversation.